Long before spells were written in books or magic had labels, it often lived in the simplest actions of daily life. A thread pulled through cloth, a cord twisted between fingers, a knot drawn tight with intention. There's something ancient about tying, isn't there? It's one of the earliest skills humans mastered. Securing shelter, fastening clothing, building boats. Knots held homes together and carried people across the water. They were practical, necessary everyday acts. And yet, in the quiet spaces of folklore, knots became something more. Across Britain and Northern Europe, people believed that power could be bound into rope or string. A knot could trap misfortune, or guard against harm, or seal an intention. In some traditions, knots were tied while whispering charms. Sometimes the cord would be hidden in a doorway, sometimes buried in the earth. And some women were especially skilled in this quiet craft. They knew how to tie knots that guarded sailors at sea, how to bind sickness or jealousy into cords that could later be burned or cast into running water. They were sometimes called charmers, healers, or witches, but the work they practiced was known in many places as the art of knot magic. The knot was both practical and symbolic, a meeting place between the physical and the unseen. Tonight we step into the story of the Knot Witch, the women who believed that power could be tied, held, and released, one knot at a time.
Welcome, Wanderer.
And thank you for joining us on the path.
This is the Roaming Raven podcast.
A place for old stories, whispered magic, and the folklore that still clings to the hedgerows.
Each week, we'll be guiding you through a tale drawn from witchcraft, folklore, and folk belief.
Stories of cunning folk and wise women, of charms and curses, of herbs that heal and words that bind.
We'll explore the legends themselves,
and then wander deeper into what they meant to the people who told them.
their remedies, their rituals, their fears and hopes, and the strange, beautiful ways they made sense of the world.
These are not just stories of magic. They're stories of survival, of knowledge passed quietly from hand to hand, of power found in plants, in ritual, and in the spoken word.
So make yourself comfortable, light a candle, pour a cup of tea, or walk with us beneath the trees.
This is Folklore for the Witchy, history for the curious, and a path for anyone who feels called by the old ways.
We are your hosts, Paula and Tracy, and this
is the Roaming Raven podcast.
Can you hear the wings beat? Can you hear the sound? Lifting up the heavy hearts from the frozen ground. It's the folklore of the future. It's the history of now. Taking back the scepter and the iron-willed vow. Slower now, the mist rolls in. The bird begins to sing of every hidden, holy, and forgotten thing.
the wind cellar of the Northern Isles. Along the rugged northern coasts of Scotland, where the land breaks into scattered islands and the sea stretches endlessly towards the Arctic, the wind is not simply weather. It is a force that shapes every part of life. For centuries, the people of Orkney and Shetland Islands lived by the rhythm of the sea. Fishing boats left harbour before dawn, sails straining against whatever wind the morning offered. Some days the water lay calm and still as glass, leaving sailors stranded in silence. Other days the wind howled across the waves, churning the sea into white foam and dragging clouds low across the horizon. For fishermen whose lives depended on the weather, the wind could mean survival or disaster. And so, like many communities that live close to nature's unpredictability, the islanders developed their own quiet traditions of protection and magic. Among these traditions were stories of women who could sell the wind. These women were not grand sorcerers or mysterious figures hidden deep in forests. Most lived ordinary lives in the small fishing villages that dotted the islands. They were often older women who had lived long enough to understand the moods of the sea and sky. Some were widows, some midwives, some herbalists who already had a reputation for small acts of healing or blessing. But among the fishermen, they were known for something else. They were said to know the secret of the knots. When a sailor was preparing for a long journey across the cold northern waters, he might visit one of these women before setting sail. He would bring a small payment, sometimes a coin, sometimes food, sometimes simply a favour promised for the future. And in return, the woman would take a length of cord. Sitting quietly by the hearth, she would begin to tie knots. The first knot would be drawn slowly, her fingers moving carefully around the rope as she murmured words too soft to hear clearly. When the knot was tightened, she would hold it for a moment, as if sealing something invisible inside it. Then she would tie the second, and finally the third. The rope was then given to the sailor with very clear instructions. The first knot, he was told, held a gentle breeze. If the sea fell still and the sails hung limp, he could untie the first knot and release the wind trapped inside. A steady current of air would fill the sails and guide the boat safely forward. The second knot carried a stronger wind, one that could push the ship quickly across open water when the journey demanded speed. But the third knot was different. That knot, the women would warn, should only be opened in the greatest emergency, for the third knot held a storm. Some fishermen swore they had seen it happen. They claimed that when the knot was untied, the sky would darken, clouds gathering as if summoned from the edges of the horizon. The wind would rise suddenly, filling the sails with fierce power. Of course, the stories rarely ended with the third knot being used wisely. In many versions of the tale, a curious sailor unties the final knot too early, or a careless deckhand loosens it without understanding the warning. Almost immediately, the sea erupts into violent waves and roaring wind, forcing the crew to battle the storm they themselves have unleashed. Whether these knots truly held the wind, or whether they simply held the sailors' faith, is impossible to know. But the stories were common enough that they were recorded by folklorists in the 19th century, long after the traditions themselves had begun to fade, and they reveal something fascinating about the quiet craft of the knot witch. The power of her magic did not come from elaborate rituals or mysterious ingredients. Instead, it came from something simple and deeply symbolic, the act of tying and binding. Knots have always held meaning for human beings, long before writing existed. Knots were used to store information, secure tools, fasten clothing, and build shelter. A knot holds tension. It binds two ends together. It keeps something from slipping away. In folklore, this practical action became something more. To tie a knot was to hold something in place, whether that was a wish, a promise, a memory, or a force of nature itself. Across Europe, similar traditions appeared in many forms. In some villages, knots were tied into cords to protect homes from illness. In others, young women tied knots while whispering love charms, hoping to bind affection between themselves and a future partner. Some healers tied knots to capture sickness within a cord that could then be buried or burned. Others used them as protective charms, hanging knotted threads above doorways or sewing them secretly into clothing. What all these practices shared was the belief that intention could be held in physical form, that a simple thread, shaped by patient hands, could carry meaning far beyond the moment it was tied. Perhaps that is why the image of the knot witch continues to appear in folklore long after many other traditions have been forgotten. She represents a kind of magic that feels both mysterious and familiar, a magic that lives not in grand ceremonies, but in the quiet rhythm of everyday actions. A cord twisted between fingers, a knot pulled tight, a moment of focused intention woven into something small enough to carry in a pocket, yet powerful enough, perhaps, to change the course of a journey.
Listen close to the obsidian bird, speaking the secrets that are seldom heard. It's not just spells or a silver moon, it's the healing heart and a sacred tune.
So the idea of knot magic appears in so many different cultures, doesn't it? And I think that's one of the things that makes this tradition particularly fascinating. It's not limited to just one region or one historical period.
Yeah, that's right. We see it in Northern Europe with sailors and wind knots, but we also see knot magic appear in love charms, protective amulets, and even healing practices. The basic idea is always the same, that a knot can literally hold something.
And that something could be anything, right? It could be an intention, a prayer, a wish, or even a problem that somebody wants to bind or control.
Right. In some traditions, tying knots was believed to bind illness or misfortune, so it could no longer affect the person. Once the knot held that energy, the cord might be buried or thrown into moving water, so that the problem could quite literally be carried away.
Lovely idea. What I find particularly interesting is that knot magic is so simple, isn't it? It doesn't require any special tools or materials. You don't need some bizarre herbs or anything more complex.
Yeah, exactly. A piece of string is enough. A ribbon, a thread, a cord from clothing, literally anything that could be tied and untied.
It makes it incredibly accessible, doesn't it? It's a form of magic that anyone could practice quietly in their own home without drawing any attention whatsoever.
We don't want any of that.
No, we certainly don't.
And that might be one reason it survives so long in folklore. It blends perfectly into everyday life. Someone tying knots in a cord might just look like they're fixing something, but they could actually be performing a small ritual.
You would never know, would you? So you wouldn't know if they were fixing something or in fact doing something which was deeply symbolic. A knot holds tension. It connects two ends together, prevents something from coming apart at its simplest, but that might be a symbolic act.
So metaphorically, it becomes the perfect symbol for holding something in place, whether that's protection, love, memory, or intention.
It's rather lovely, actually, isn't it? So let's talk about how knot magic reflects how we humans understand control and uncertainty, which of course is central to so many things that we've talked about in the podcast. This sense of control and how we control the uncertain in life. When life feels unpredictable, we naturally look for ways to hold things steady, don't we?
Yeah, and tying a knot is one of the oldest physical actions humans perform. It's practical. We use knots to secure shelter, clothing, tools, boats, but symbolically it becomes something so much deeper.
Like commitment, for example. right? Once it's tied, it changes the shape of the cord permanently until you undo it.
And that's why knots appear in so many symbolic traditions. Think about marriage, tying the knot. That's what we've all done. Or ancient protective cords worn around the wrist or waist.
And in folklore, knots were sometimes used to bind harmful influences or prevent negative energy from entering a home.
But they could also be used to hold positive intentions. For example, someone might tie 9 knots into a cord while focusing on protection for a loved one who was travelling.
We've talked about numbers several times before, haven't we? So in this sense, 9 knots, each knot is a moment of intention.
Yeah, and that's what's really beautiful about that idea, is that the object itself becomes a record of the ritual. Every knot represents a thought, a hope, a moment of focus.
Gorgeous idea. So in a way, the cord is a physical memory of the magic that was placed into it.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
It is pretty cool, isn't it? Let's look at some historical case studies then, starting with the witch knots of the Western Isles. Because it sounds like it's something from a story, but in fact it was absolutely real. And in some places it survived right into the 20th century. And we'll start with this fascinating example from the Scottish Highlands, where witches were known to, get this, sell wind to sailors.
No, seriously.
Yep.
And this wasn't just folklore, it was a genuine practical transaction. A witch would give a sailor a length of cord tied with 3 knots. If he untied the first knot, he'd get a fair wind. The second brought a strong gale, and the third, a destructive storm.
Good money if you can get it, that's what I say. So these sailors believed this so strongly that they'd only untie the first 2 knots at most, and the third knot stayed tied, just in case. And this belief, incredibly, was so widespread that it even appears in trial records. Witches were accused of selling these knotted cords to fishermen across Scotland and the Isle of Man, Ireland and Scandinavia.
There's a rather wonderful and terrifying story from Portessie about a crew of fishermen who were given a piece of twine with 3 knots in it. The seller told them to untie the first when they raised the sail, the second if they needed more wind. But she said nothing about the third knot. Dun dun dun. And when the sailors grew impatient at sea and untied it, a sudden storm erupted and all hell broke loose.
Of course it did. You can always rely on human curiosity to put a spanner in the works, can't you? So these knots, they could release immense power, but they could also bind it, couldn't they? And that's where knot magic gets its darker reputation. For example, in the 17th century, the astrologer Simon Foreman recorded that witches could render a man impotent by tying 3 or 9 knots on a lace or thread, sometimes even during the wedding ceremony itself. Oh my goodness. So they'd whisper, "Whom God hath joined together, let the devil separate."
And it wasn't just for cursing. Knots could also prevent. There's an old ballad called Willie's Lady, where a witch secretly knots the bride's hair ribbons to prevent her from giving birth. The labour couldn't progress until the knots were undone.
But there are nice things about knot magic too. So it was used for love and healing. For example, in Norway, young sailors would propose marriage by tying a lover's knot in a red silk ribbon and sending it to the girl. If she returned it untied, what do you think that meant?
The wedding was on.
It meant the answer was no. But if she tightened the knot and sent it back, the wedding was on. That was a yes.
Muddled. Okay. And for healing, knots were used for everything, from whooping cough to warts. Well, if it works for one thing, you might as well try it for everything, hadn't you? A knotted thread might be worn around the neck until the illness passed and then thrown away, carrying the sickness with it.
And even Shakespeare knew about not magic. In Romeo and Juliet, Mercutio describes Queen Mab, the mischievous fairy queen, who plats the manes of horses in the night.
And that tradition didn't die out. As recently as 2010, a horse owner in Cheshire found 2 men knotting the mane of her horse. The police investigated the possibility that it was part of a pagan rite, not magic, still being practiced.
Wow, that's a weird one. I mean, what would you do if you saw a couple of chaps out in your horse field and in the night playing around with your horse's mane? That would be a bit startling,
Very
wouldn't it?
suspicious.
Crikey. So, the Knot Witch, she wasn't just a figure from ancient stories. She existed genuinely in fishing villages on remote islands in the quiet corners of rural life. And her magic was in her hands, in the twist of a cord, the pull of a thread, or the tension of a knot drawn tightly.
Binding or releasing, cursing or curing. One knot could hold the wind, seal a marriage, or stop a heart, all from a piece of string.
Wow, you know what? I think I need to get more stringing. It's clearly really flexible stuff, isn't it? We can apply this for everything.
I'm definitely getting some in.
And anyway, that's the power we're talking about tonight. The quiet, ancient craft of tying and untying the threads of fate. Shall we talk about then? Well, we don't have any herbs to talk about, although not necessarily, because, we can tie herbs into knots. So although knot magic primarily uses cord or thread, we can combine it with herbs or other small objects tied into the knots themselves.
Yeah, and this is where knot magic overlaps beautifully with other forms of folk magic like charm bags or protective bundles. A protective cord might include rosemary for protection, lavender for peace, or other herbs tied directly into the knots.
And the cord itself sometimes carried meaning, didn't it? For example, red thread appears in lots of traditions as a protective colour and might have been worn as a bracelet to ward off harm from, any dodgy stuff, really.
And the number of knots, as we know, is bound to matter. 3 is extremely common. 3 knots, 3 repetitions of a charm, 3 spoken words. But 9 is especially significant.
Seems very deliberate, doesn't it? Tying 9 knots. You can't rush 9 knots. It forces you to concentrate and be patient. And I think that changes your mental state. It's almost like a meditation.
Yeah, so whether someone believed in literal magic or not, the process itself was calming and intentional.
And let's not forget the rhyme, the traditional rhyme that we associate with knot spells. By knot of 1, the spell's begun. By knot of 2, it comes true.
And the rhyme continues until the 9th knot seals the intention. That combination of spoken words and physical action, voice and movement, is very common in folk magic.
Absolutely. And it shows that knot magic wasn't just about the rope. It involved sound, rhythm, repetition, as well as belief. And each knot represented a different stage of intention, building the spell up gradually. And
that made it incredibly rich symbolically, and shows how spoken charm traditions and knot magic often work together.
Yeah, I mean, even today, knot magic still appears in modern spiritual practices, doesn't it? Although we might not always recognise it by that name.
Yeah, you think about friendship bracelets, intention cords, and even mindfulness exercises where people tie knots while focusing on gratitude or personal goals.
In many ways, it works similarly to journaling or meditation, doesn't it? Like, it creates this moment where you pause and you direct your thoughts towards something meaningful.
And because it's so simple, it can be very accessible ritual. Anyone can take a piece of thread and tie knots while focusing on a particular intention.
I love the way that some people can use it as a way of releasing their worries. So you tie a knot for each of your concerns, and then you later untie the cord, the knot, as a symbolic act of letting go.
That's a cool idea. Others create protective cords to hang in their homes or carry while travelling.
So although the cultural language around magic might have changed, the basic human instinct, it remains the same, doesn't it?
Yeah, we still look for small physical actions that help us express hope, protection, and intention.
So what about the places where not magic used to take place? Because I think one of the most fascinating things about it is that it isn't just one region. It appears across many cultures in very similar forms.
Yeah, and this tells us something important. When a tradition shows up in different parts of the world, it often means it speaks to a shared human experience.
Exactly. Knots are universal. Every culture uses them for clothing, shelter, tools, boats. So of course it makes sense that knots became symbolic.
In ancient Norse communities, ropes were essential for sailing. It's not surprising that sailors developed rituals around knots. When your survival depends on a rope, you naturally develop respect for it.
Do you think that's why they teach knots in the Scouts?
Well, they do, don't they? It's an important part.
They do.
Yeah.
And let's face it, it's a really useful skill.
Yeah.
One of the earliest things you learn in life is tying your shoelaces, after all. But tying your shoelaces maybe doesn't hold spiritual power, unlike knots in other traditions that were thought to trap or contain something.
This idea appears in Greek folklore as well. There were binding spells, sometimes written on small tablets, where the intention was to bind someone's actions or influence. And then there's the famous story of the Gordian knot.
Ooh, tell me about the Gordian
Well,
knot.
Greek legend says that King Midas tied a cart to a post with an intricate knot. An oracle foretold that whoever untied the knot would become king of Asia. Years passed, the knot remained untouched until 333 BC, when Alexander the Great tried to unravel it. He couldn't, so he drew his sword and cut the knot in half.
I'm sorry, but doesn't that seem like cheating? I mean, that's hardly unravelling the knot,
No,
is it?
no.
Poor old Midas, he goes to all that trouble to make an
He wasn't taking it
intricate
seriously,
knot.
was he?
He clearly didn't know. He was a brute force chap. So did he become king of Asia?
Well, he did become king of Asia. The story tells us something important about knots, that they can represent challenges, fate, or destiny. And sometimes the solution isn't untying, it's cutting.
Aha. And those spells weren't always about harm either, were they? In some cases, they were simply meant to restrain negative forces or protect against some unwanted influence.
Yeah, the idea of binding isn't automatically negative. It can mean protection, containment, or control.
Powerful symbolism. When you tie a knot, you're literally bringing two ends together and stopping them from separating.
Which makes it a perfect metaphor for unity, commitment, protection, or even love.
Yeah, you can see why it's connected to things like marriages and hand tying and tying the knot. So let's go back to the sailors, because knot magic's very closely linked to sailors, isn't it? Let's talk about maritime superstition a bit more.
Absolutely. So sailors historically had countless rituals and taboos. The sea was unpredictable and dangerous, so superstition provided psychological protection.
Oh, of course. For example, whistling on a ship that was often believed to summon up a storm.
Yeah, because whistling sounds like wind, so it was thought to attract stronger winds.
And what about the whole thing about women on board being bad luck?
Well, generally that was how we were viewed, isn't it? which likely reflects social attitudes of the time, but it also shows how deeply superstition was woven into maritime culture.
And the ropes themselves were actually treated with a lot of respect, weren't they? Because knots weren't simply practical, they were also symbolic.
In some traditions, sailors would refuse to untie certain knots during storms, believing it would make conditions worse.
Yikes, so knot magic and sailor superstition overlap naturally.
Yeah, because knots were everywhere in their daily lives. It makes sense that meaning would attach itself to something that was so essential to them.
So let's talk about some of the recorded folk uses of knot spells beyond the wind knots.
Well, one common practice involved tying knots in a cord while focusing on protection for a home or a family member.
Each knot representing a layer of defence.
Yeah, and sometimes the cord would be hung above a doorway to symbolically guard the entrance.
And there were also love-related knot charms where two threads were tied together to symbolise union, as we said earlier.
And I guess that's where the phrase tying the knot that we mentioned earlier may have originated, linking marriage to binding symbolism.
Yeah, absolutely. And in healing traditions, knots were also related to binding illness.
Yeah, and after the ritual, the cord might be buried or discarded in moving water to symbolically remove the condition.
And that shows, doesn't it, how knot magic often worked in combination with other symbolic actions such as burial or fire or water.
Yeah, it was rarely just one action. It was all part of a broader ritual system.
So the story of the Knot Witch reminds us that magic in folklore was rarely elaborate or dramatic. More often, it lived in small actions repeated with care and attention. A thread tied around a wrist, a cord knotted beside the fire, or a rope carried aboard a fishing boat. These simple objects held meaning because people believed that intention could live within them. And whether or not the knots truly held the wind, they held something just as powerful. Hope. Hope for safe journeys, hope for protection, hope that someone, somewhere, was quietly wishing for your well-being. In that sense, knot magic tells us something timeless about human nature. We are creatures who tie meaning into the smallest things, and sometimes those small things help us face a much larger world.
Next week, we leave behind the hearth, the rope, and the quiet craft of knots, and step onto the road, because not all witches stayed in one place. Some were travellers. They moved between villages, crossing fields, forests, and boundaries. They were the ones who walked the hedges, the liminal spaces between farms, towns, and wild land. These travelling witches were known as hedge walkers, figures who existed between communities, carrying knowledge from place to place. Some were herbalists, some were healers, some were storytellers, and some were feared for their independence and mobility. They understood roads, thresholds, crossroads, and boundaries, not just physically, but spiritually. So next week, we follow the path beyond the village into the world of the hedgewalker, the travelling witch who lived between worlds. And that brings us to the end of today's episode of Witch Lore. Thank you for walking these ancient paths with us. We will be back soon with another story from the hedge and the hearth. Until then, may your path be curious and kind. From Paula, Tracy, and all of us at Roaming Raven, blessed be. If you enjoyed this show, please consider giving us a positive review on whatever platform you're listening on. Thank you to Georgia Rolls for our wonderful artwork, and to Psych Witch who wrote and produced our music. Find more of her lovely sounds on Spotify. This podcast has been produced by Roaming raven.
Roaming through the history, roaming through the dark.